methodology. Here's a piece of the Thompson house. This piece of wood was taken out over 100 years ago. Okay, and I'm going to let you look at it. I'm just going to pass it around. This was taken out upstairs because they moved the house and they took the old cookhouse, which was also old, and they pushed it into the back of the house to make the wing in the rear. So they had to take out windows, etc. And this is part of one window on the second floor. And it shows the mark of the gang saw. And so you can pass it around here, and you can see very clearly the mark of the gang saw. That is not a modern saw blade that was passing through the signatures there. There's a second signature. If you look at old houses around here, and some of you do live nearby, and you live in old houses, you can date your house within an interval based on that type of wood. If you see that type of wood and you see that type of cut, you know it's relatively old. But here's the clincher. There's a nail exposed on the back there. If you turn it over, you will see the nail. And the nail is a cut nail. And cut nails are made from a piece of iron. They probably made them here in Baghdad. And so the steam engine would drop a blade down on a bar of iron. Chop, a nail comes off. Flip it, chop, another nail. Flip it back and forth, back and forth. Those are cut nails. They stopped making cut nails in about 1890. Well, they make them now, but in general. In 1890 and thereafter, it was wire nails. So you can date a building by just looking at that type of wood and the type of nail that's present. So I know that piece of wood came out of a building that was older than 1890. That I can say with certainty. Okay? And there it is. And you can see the cut marks very quickly. All right, show and tell, I guess. So he built his house. He built his house according to patterns. Now, I have another question for you students. Do you remember the old Capitol building in Tallahassee? I mean, the old one. Mm-hmm. Who went into the old building prior to the remodeling that they did? Okay. Do you remember how, well, you remember when a huge amount of, there were many additions there that were torn down. What you see now is just a small portion of what was there originally. But what was the structure like in the oldest part of the building? Florida became a state when? 1845, right? Okay. And that building was constructed at approximately that point in time. And we're talking about when the Thompson house was constructed, roughly 1847. So if you went into the old Capitol building in Tallahassee and looked around, that's the front hall in the building where I live. That's exactly the type of interior that you would see. Why don't you see that today? Because they remodeled it and they tore out all the old interior and they used a later date as their standard. And that's what happened to the building. And Nathan is shaking his head up and down. He knows very clearly. I don't know why they made that decision. Do you know?
Well, they wanted to make it look like it did in 1902, so they chose sort of an arbitrary date in the turn of the century.
Okay.
When there was another renovation, restoration that was done. So they took it to that date. They didn't go back further. So they just picked that date and that's what it.
But it's another clue relative to the age of the Thompson house when it was constructed. So the techniques were the techniques of cutting the lumber that you can see here as you look at what the displays here in the museum. And the patterns were based on patterns that he could get from books, which they probably used to build the old Capitol and so forth, and his people did the work. Did they use big nails to put timbers together then?
Pegs?
They use wooden pegs. So I can go under the house and look at these huge timbers that hold up the floor, and I'll see that somebody used an auger to drill a hole through, and they notch the timbers so they fit together like a puzzle in this manner, and then they drive a peg in to hold everything together. But that moves also, and that house has been moved, and that story comes later. Are you following me so far? So here we are, so far. Here we are now in 1847. Let's advance to 1860 and 1861. Actually, I want to go to 1855. Something happened in 1855. Aside from the fact that Benjamin Thompson's wife died, someone else died. A very important member of this community. His name was Joseph Forsyth. Joseph Forsyth died. When Joseph Forsyth died, something happened that was rather fascinating. That's the exact point in time at which Benjamin Woodson Thompson became a partner in Forsyth and Simpson, right at that point in time. So he was very close, apparently, to the Simpson family. That's something that was probably true. All right, so that gives me a little bit of a clue in terms of what was happening. Simpson was also the individual who was the executor, one of two executors for Forsyth's estate. So there were a lot of things going on there with respect to how the mill properties were handled and how Thompson came on board as a partner. But then just shortly after that, and Thompson's wife died at that time, just shortly after that, an event happened that was earth-shaking in the United States. We call it the Civil War. And I think all of you remember during the Civil War that many people died. And I think everyone remembers that more people died in the Civil War than in all previous wars in the United States. And if you go back and look at the record, if you look at the record in terms of how many people died in World War II, far more died during the Civil War. 2% of the United States population died during the Civil War. Many people died here. Okay? So let's get on to that part of the story and how it impacted the Thompson family. Dave Kumar, you remember him. And he wrote a rather interesting article about what happened here relative to the Civil War. And then Nathan has written about Beard's Raid. And you have a beautiful article published in a scholarly journal on Beard's Raid. Well, I think Beard came from Tallahassee, didn't he? And that's where the 1st Florida Regiment was organized. This is the Confederate 1st Florida. There was also a Yankee group. Ooh, did I use that word? There was also a Union group called the 1st Florida. They had cavalry. They're all from Florida. It's kind of interesting. And I'll tell you why that happened. All right. So all of these people were getting ready for the, quote, war. What's the name of the fort on Santa Rosa Island? Pickens. Okay, Pickens. Was there a battle at Fort Pickens? I know they did fire shells back and forth. But was there a battle on Santa Rosa Island? Well, local people volunteered to go to fight in that particular battle. Okay? Benjamin Thompson had 2 sons at that point in time. And I had a major problem here trying to find out, was Benjamin Thompson actually in the Confederate Army in some way? I have found no clear evidence, but his sons certainly were. So his 2 sons, by that time he was well into his 50s. A 50-year-old man fighting under those conditions, you just wonder if that's possible. There were many older men. There were usually the generals, etc., that did fight. But let me get to my point now. So there was a fight there on Santa Rosa Island, and without question, his sons were there. His sons were there. And they survived that. But then Braxton Bragg, who was the general in charge of this area, said, those Yankees are coming, and we have to do something. They can't have the resources that are here. So he told Beard to take your soldiers to Baghdad and burn it. Baghdad burning. Burn what? Burn anything the Yankees could use. Okay. How were buildings in those days protected from rain? Did they have asphalt shingles on? Of course not. What did they have on the roof? They had wooden shingles. So these Confederate soldiers arrived here and they were burning the mill, and they did burn the mill. They burned all the mill resources. They burned the ships that were here. They just burned everything. You ever see a big building on fire? You visualize a large building on fire? I've seen a number of them in my years. And I remember one, I was hundreds of feet away. I could not stand there. It was so hot. I had to retreat. It would kill you. The flames produce an enormous amount of heat. What else do they produce?
Smoke, ash.
Huge amounts of embers, burning embers, pieces of wood flying up in the air. It's like a hurricane. You know, this huge amount of air rising up, carrying all of that. Does it come back down someplace? Come down on all those buildings nearby. All the wealthy Baghdadians owned homes, etc., that are relatively close to the